Cool, let's start.
Hello, everyone.
Hey everyone. Welcome to Contino Live, and we'll be talking about why an awesome DevEx is crucial to enterprise cloud adoption. Already see some familiar names in the attendees. Good to see you all. Cool. So I'm Hibri. I'm a principal consultant at Contino, and I like helping teams use technology and deliver awesome ideas with tech. Also like the challenges of using public cloud, and big fan of continuous delivery, and love helping team deliver at a sustainable pace. I also like to use systems thinking and see how we can use systems thinking to address complexity. And I'm here in this webinar with my colleague, Ruchir. Hey, Ruchir.
Hello, hey everyone. Hey, thanks, Hibri. Yeah, thanks everyone for joining our Contino live session. Seeing a few people still trickling through, so welcome aboard. Yeah, I'm Ruchir. I am account principal at Contino. My kind of passion is primarily sort of trying to help build great engineering culture, followed in by developer experience, which is very close to my heart, and how that can really help adopt public cloud adoption, and really helping teams adapt in the given whatever circumstances we find ourselves under. I do this by essentially leveraging sort of best engineering practices, enabling transformation using sort of DevOps, Agile, and Lean practices as well.
Cool, Ruchir. So let's start off. What is DevEx?
Yeah, good question, Hibri. So DevEx, essentially developer experience. I'm not sure if you might have heard of this before, but effectively what we're talking about here is a point of view. So when we're talking about software delivery, the entire software development lifecycle, regardless of what processes you follow, but really taking a focal point from a developer experience perspective, because ultimately the heart of software delivery is where the developers sit in terms of how to optimize software delivery, how to tackle productivity. So really, it's taking the experiences from a developer perspective, who are kind of the heart, the core engine of any software delivery lifecycle engagement, and really sort of pivoting from their point of view. How does from their point of view, how does code kind of go from early design to development, into testing, into pre-prod, prod, so on and so forth. So really kind of engaging the developer, having that developer-centric point of view, and how it impacts their lives in terms of the development experience.
Yeah, it's like rolling out the red carpet experience for devs.
Yeah, effectively, yeah, that's a really good way of putting it, actually, because it's that what is a good if developers were kind of walking out on the red carpet, what makes their lives easier in terms of software delivery.
Yeah, it's like look, no hands.
Yeah, exactly, right. It's like learning to ride a bike. That's a really good way of putting it, because a lot of times we kind of see developers kind of trying to be able to develop code at pace, but really they get stopped or stumbled against various restrictions that might appear in an organization. So it's really giving developers that capability so that they can write on their own. And we do this by essentially kind of still having guardrails in place. So there's so we can have faster feedback loops, using some of the best of kind of the agile and lean methodologies. Ultimately, really, the agile principles of people over processes, right? It kind of comes back to that. Like let's bring the people back in, and really, from a psychological perspective, how does that impact their ways of working effectively?
Yeah. So what should they be able to do?
So yeah, so when we were thinking about this in terms of what we've seen across various of our engagements, across having done software delivery for the last 10 years myself, like how can what do I want, right? As if I'm a developer in a feature team, working in a team where I'm able to do the best I can, deliver value-add software, not having to worry about all the processes that are going on in the background. So as a developer, really, I want to be able to have a whole bunch of capabilities. I want to be able to kind of independently build, version, deploy, and release the code that I'm doing and get it in front of the end customer. It ties into things like definition of done. I've seen so many places where there's no agreed DoD that people follow, and it's just, as a result, there's confusion from a developer's perspective. I might not have things like a dedicated Scrum Master, maybe. I've seen teams where Scrum Masters are spread across various functional product teams, and it means that it's only a tick box as a Scrum Master rather than actually adopting some of the continuous improvement and agile practices and actually applying them in principle. A whole bunch of stuff usually happens around metrics, right? And I know we've had various engagements, Hibri, where we've put in DORA metrics, but really we don't really act on it, and there's no visibility around any of these metrics. And all of these kind of things in terms of getting throughput and stability in terms of getting that visibility across the metric piece is really useful. Also, one of the other areas is around safe and secured sandbox environments, right? A number of times I've sort of worked in this is specifically like within the financial services sector, for example, working at banking, within the banking industry as an instance. It's all lockdown heavy environments. We're not really able to, as a developer, in a way to test out new things because there's lots of restrictions, lots of lockdown capabilities. I know for a fact, Hibri, you also had something similar, right, in one of your engagements?
Yeah, and all of this, like as a starting point, all these capabilities create the environment where these dev teams need to succeed. So the developer experience is not just focusing on the devs themselves. There's an interplay with the environment that these teams exist as well. But who really are the devs in DevEx? So do you build a platform?
Yeah, that's a really good question, right? Because a lot of times it's not just the folks who are writing the code, right? It's across. I go back to the entire route to life, right? Entire SDLC, any touch points where you're building the platform, whether it's the application layer, the infrastructure layer, it doesn't really matter which layer. You could potentially be building on top of that platform. So we talk about the layers in a minute shortly, but it could be people who are actually operating that platform from an operational capability as well. Even they need to have the same kind of experiences. Effectively, if the answer is, you're building or running or owning things that are running on the platform, the chances are you are one of those developers who we're talking about in terms of having these kind of capabilities be enabled for you to be able to do much more with what's in front of you.
Yeah, and that's important. Again, what we observe in the enterprise is that there tend to be different classes of devs, like the teams who build the infrastructure that teams use have a different experience to the dev teams who are building front-end or back-end applications. So it shouldn't be easy for one class of teams and hard for another class of teams. Everyone should be productive and everyone should have the same or similar metrics, kind of same Scrum Master, Agile coaches, and be set up to succeed. Let's talk about this wall of confusion that limits the developer experience.
Yeah, that's a really good way of kind of leading into it. So, as an example, right, we worked in various gigs where, what we've called this is the wall of confusion, right? And it ultimately, and you might have seen this yourselves, where it leads into a very high friction environment. And it all comes down to kind of feedback loops and debugging loops being broken. So, you might have sort of CI/CD built in. So in here, developers has committed the code, they're using all the right tools, they're on the cloud, build and test capabilities going on. And they're able to deploy something, and something's gone being deployed into production, but then something goes wrong, right? Now developer kind of notices it, raises a ticket, issuing, describing the issue and the outcome, and that could be done in seconds to minutes, but really that feedback brook is broken straight away when it kind of goes into an ops team somewhere, where the ops team is only monitoring the portal, but they're only working in terms of whatever the priority is. So and they'll have lots of things on their mind, so they might not necessarily be able to get to that quickly, or else the developer in question here might not have access to the portal, so they won't be able to actually see the logs, for example. They might not be able to diagnose what's actually gone wrong. So there's a lot of back and forth of ticketing that happens as a result, and it just creates a wall of confusion in terms of who's owning the ticket. Ultimately, what this means is that there's bad business being done, right? Because there's delays, there's something broken in production, and it's impacting business and it's impacting the end customer.
Yeah, it comes from a mindset of bringing the same processes that work with on-prem infrastructure into the cloud world. We don't let people access to systems in case they kind of actually break the hardware or are able to SSH into certain machines. But public cloud gives us more capabilities to just address this with role-based access control, stuff like that. Yeah, and this is an example of the impact of a poor developer experience. It's a poor developer experience can create a low effective environment where the developer's effectiveness is very low. And Tim Cochran in his paper talks about learned helplessness. Even in a very restricted environment, even when those restrictions are removed, devs won't know how to be more productive, and that helplessness is sort of ingrained. They still keep following the same processes that they thought that were very ineffective. Yeah, and this sort of like bars represent the difference between a high effective environment and low effective environment.
Yeah, that's a really good one, Hibri, because a lot of times, right, especially if you kind of look at this in terms of the low effective environment, the areas in terms of governance, for example, deployments and ensuring something works in production can take a really long time. Validating that you've got integration happening properly, working well with other components, another area where a lot of time can be spent. So effectively what that means, from again coming back to the developer experience element, what this means is that you as a developer, you're spending time spent waiting. That's time spent sort of utilizing cloud resources. Ultimately, that's time spent just making coffee, right? We're not doing a lot if you're just waiting on bills and just looking at things to kind of go through the pipeline. And that can again lead to poor developer experiences, which can lead to all sorts of problems in terms of staff retention problems, for example, because there's other places in the business where within the industry that are sort of solving this and doing this a lot better. And as a result, an organization, especially within an enterprise environment, will really struggle to retain and keep the good talent that they have.
And yeah, devs will, even what we see is like the driver to deliver features means that people will find a way around all these restrictions, because there's no other pressure than the pressure to deliver features, which means
that's right. Because they'll always find a workaround, right? And so the whole idea behind developer experience is to make it easier for developers to try and do the right thing, but also do it safely. I've seen at times where to kind of get a workaround in place, if something goes wrong in production, fire off a shell script into production or something like that, and it can cause a lot more damage, for instance, because that was the quickest way to do something, because they didn't have access to the right way of doing it, and that's kind of where it all kind of falls apart. And again, going back to the whole, putting in those hacks in production can then even cause and add more technical debt, and really increase that. It could result in having blackouts, for instance, or delivery of features being pushed out. Effectively, all of these not having a good developer experience in place, and developers having to have these kind of shortcuts and really making a lot of hard work for something that should be fairly straightforward, could again, productivity goes down, dysfunctional and demotivated teams come out, developers end up being burnt out. We've seen that so much over the last year, especially where the way things are going, there's a lot of burning out happening, and effectively also enables a toxic culture at times as well. I don't know if you've seen that, Hibri, but I've certainly kind of experienced that, where it's just get it done kind of culture rather than trying to do the right thing.
And that's good thing you pointed out there about the technical debt of a poor DevEx, and as the technical debt piles up, it becomes even harder and harder to build better tooling, because now the tooling that improves the developer experience has to take into account all these hacks that have accumulated over the years and months. So yeah, there's a couple of about 4 factors we've looked at that helps the developer experience, or to build a good DevEx. It's good to understand boundaries and interactions. Every platform has layers, and it's really important to understand all these layers.
I love that meme.
And when we say the developer experience and being an effective developer, it doesn't really mean that you give devs carte blanche to go and do everything. By understanding the layers and the boundaries and interactions between the layers, we actually start to see that it's actually a very small constrained space that this developer experience is restricted to. If you look at it, a platform which is the thinnest possible API wrapper around a cloud provider, that provides a layer for product teams to be successful, and the platform enables product teams, and the product team in turn enables users, who then in turn enable the organization to reach its goal. So how each layer enables the others, and how each layer stands on shoulders of giants, so to speak, is really important. And these layers are what we typically do when we build out our landing zones. And if you look at landing zones on top of a platform, you actually see that the platform is a curated experience, and on that platform we have our landing zones, and it's good to understand the boundaries of those landing zones and the responsibilities. So the platform is responsible for providing a governed safe space for product delivery, and this governed safe space is different for each organization. So the safe space that worked in one organizational context is not the same as what works in your organization. It's important to understand who owns platform governance, who owns governance for shared components, and it's important to understand that the product team owns the product governance, product risk, and owns the product end-to-end delivery. Ruchir and I have seen where the developer experience tends to break down is that there's confusion over who's responsible for what, and these boundaries and interactions aren't very clear.
Yeah, and I think the other point you made there in terms of those boundaries is something else that's an overarching, and especially with enterprise and when cloud adoption starts, is you might start adopting the cloud, but really there's no clear operating model in place that allows for all of this kind of veracity matrix effectively in terms of who does what, when, and how. And those are all the things that have a direct impact on the developer experience in terms of how they can actually react to or sort of try and make sure that things don't go wrong in the first place. But because there's that, again, going back to that wall of confusion is another example where this kind of things sort of start pop up.
Yeah, Yeah, it's important to understand how different teams interact with the product team. So if we're making the developer experience awesome for a product team, we can use the team topologies to understand the interactions. If you see here, like security, governance, architecture, agile coaching, or facilitate product teams to be awesome and create that environment where there's a great DevEx and there's a strong contract with the platform team of what services they offer. Yeah, and it's really good, like just like all the public cloud providers have built their own shared responsibility model, within your organization also you should be building these shared responsibility models, like what is the platform team responsible for and what is the product team responsible for, and how that layering works. It's good to have those boundaries demarcated. For example, so just to kind of give an example at a technical level, this is a Azure Cloud Adoption Enterprise Cloud Adoption Framework design, and if you see here in blue are the platform team responsibilities, and in green we have the product team responsibilities. So you actually see, like if you zoom out to the platform and the whole cloud infrastructure estate, the playing field for product teams and where this developer experience is made great, it's actually quite small and tightly controlled within tightly controlled boundaries. Cool. Yeah. The other second factor that helps a good DevEx is enabling continuous delivery by default. Like day one, when you write a piece of code, that's very low risk, and it's quite important to get those habits in place from the beginning. What I'd like to do when I first start working on a platform or on a product team, I'd like to build a walking skeleton, which is a tiny implementation of the actual system. Just no meat on the bones, just a skeleton, what it would look like, no functionality, but with all the key integration points, which gives me something to hang my architecture off. So this is a minimal system. It's got very low risk, and I'd like to sort of deploy it all the way to production after I've built it. And the process of taking this walking skeleton to all the environments, dev, test, prod, flags up where the developer experience is broken. It flags up like what a developer's life is like day to day. If a very minimal system is very hard to deploy and push through all the different environments, then when we start building more complex features, that's just going to get exponentially difficult.
Yeah, and I think Hibri, on your point on the walking skeleton and kind of deploying that to production, it's very much kind of that sort of that MVP approach, right? Effectively, because it's the silver lining across your entire organization.
Yeah.
You know, whether you're talking about sort of product ownership to business analysis to kind of design, UX, UI, in touching into testing or even sort of operational elements of it, security, sort of all these areas where there'll be touch points within that route to live again, and getting that into production as quickly as you can with the concepts of continuous delivery will again just help to highlight where, from a developer perspective, where are things going wrong, where are the bottlenecks that are happening, and where the feedback loops being cut off.
Yeah. And what really matters is production, right? That's where our real users live. Our users, or where we make money, is not in staging, where we see software delivery be stuck in lots of organizations. That developer experience should take a change a developer has done all the way through to a real user, and we see like lots of releases being stuck in system integration testing, test environments, and staging. It sometimes feels like the staging environment is more important than production, and there's a lot of like work going on to keep staging alive. So
the amount of times we've seen that, Hibri, right, where it's from again going back to the definition of done, for example, right, as a product team, I've got it in staging, development team kind of go, right, that's our job done, it works, done, and mark the ticket as done or whatever. But actually in reality, because it's not actually reached any consumer and you don't actually have that feedback in place, and it's not in production, it's not truly done, is it?
Yeah, and learning to differentiate between deployment and release is key to this. And once what we see is that deployment means everything, like installing new software and making this making it available to users. But when you start breaking it apart into deploy, test, release, there's those three steps. There's a lot of flexibility that we can have. We can deploy, do dark deploys, do some testing, and then gradually release to our users, so that developers feel safe enough to make changes. They know that a mistake would not get into production or break the experience for users. That's that confidence that there's a process that will catch it. And we can do things like feature switches, rolling releases, opens up more capabilities for monitoring. We can start using synthetic transactions to see what's happening in production. So getting closer to where a point where we can test things in production in a safe way is really key. That's good. Next slide. So pay attention for things to kind of pay attention to, like pay attention to time spent onboarding. We find that going into a new organization and getting productive is probably the biggest predictor of a good or bad developer experience. When we talk about environments, time spent going from staging to pre-prod and then pre-prod to prod could sometimes take weeks, and we should be looking to reduce them. Another predictor of a good or bad DevEx is number of times a developer or a team has to interact with another team. Yes, it's good to talk to other teams and see what they're doing, but if a developer's day-to-day work means having to talk to different teams, get permissions, get approval to do things, that's a strong predictor, that indication that the developer experience is broken.
Effectively, that means Hibri there's no autonomy, right? Because like you say, if there's lots and lots of and one way of kind of doing this is actually one of the projects that I was on, we did this evaluation of the entire Jira project that they had, and actually the number of touch points that the ticket had, just in terms of the number of people across the organization that had to interact with that ticket, kind of just went to show just how many touch points there are for something to actually go through in terms of just even getting to staging, let alone production. And again, it just highlights again visually just how many touch points there are, interactions that are happening, which has a direct impact on cycle times, which has a direct impact on the time that's spent between transitioning between environments. And your point around onboarding, time spent onboarding, I've been on customers where we've been able to onboard within hours, whilst a few different enterprise customers will take around 2 weeks almost to even get us access to the right bits. And that just, for us it's fine, but the permanent developers who are working within these organizations are just frustrated with these processes. And again, it just brings to life the kind of the challenges that developers kind of face, and how they're really how productivity is crippled as a result.
Yeah. And all this leads to the paying attention to feedback loops. So, we exist in feedback loops. We can choose to act on our feedback loops, or we can choose to ignore them to our peril. And we live in these feedback loops, whether we like it or not. And by not acting on these feedback loops and sharing that knowledge, we lose our users. We start losing our users. We start losing market share. And the simplest feedback loop we have as engineering teams and as software developers is a simple conversation with a user. When we all started building things with VB and early programming languages, when we started our careers, like, we love sort of building something and showing it to users and getting immediate feedback. And with all our complicated processes, we seem to have gone further and further away from that interaction between the people who are building it and the people who are going to be using the software. And all these processes really don't matter if we fail to provide a service or make someone happy, and by all of that make some get some value out of it. So shorter feedback loops help connect developers and teams with the user. It's almost the closer we can get to talking to our users, the better. But at scale, that can be quite hard. But there are other ways we can shorten that feedback loop. So instead of always thinking of pipelines as a one-way thing where we're pushing stuff to users, think of pipelines as a way to get feedback. We give something to users, they tell us something, we listen to it, to our logs, monitoring user activity, and asking them what happens after release. And as we need to keep that conversation going, and then that feedback loop going. So we plan to study, act continuously. Yeah, that is bring us to the final factor about discovery, visibility, and self-service, because that helps reduce the time lag that's present in all these feedback loops in the enterprise. Ruchir?
Yeah, so thanks, Hibri. Yeah, so this is again another lever to leverage, right? In terms of, again, giving developers that visibility. We talked about the feedback loops just now, and really one of the things that we see time and often, for instance, is don't lock your developers out of the cloud portals. Having able to they kind of go off into this. They do lots of training courses outside. They do, they might be learning how to use Amazon or Azure or AWS, whatever, and then they land within the organization, and, well, actually, you know what, you can't access the portal because it's locked in and you can't really do a lot. So giving developers visibility across the entire DLC can go a long way in terms of productivity levels, providing them those sandboxes for devs to play around. I mentioned at the top of this call that having in a locked-in environment, you're really stifling innovation as a result of this, because if devs aren't able to test out new capabilities, or whether it's third-party libraries that they want to use, what ends up happening is they might actually end up rewriting the third-party library that's available outside, and as a result, your technical debt again goes up. But because those ease of access isn't in place, it means that more and more kind of bad decisions are made as a result, which go fairly unnoticed. A lot of times we get told that, oh, we can't give developers access to productions. Well, hang on, why not, right? They're the ones who are writing the software. You can, but give it to them safely, right? Give them read-only access to production logs, for instance, so that when things do go wrong, they have got actually some know-how of what's going on. and there isn't the wall of confusion. Having the access to those metrics or alerting or any non-sensitive logs can go a long way in terms of giving the developers that visibility. Usually we also see things like dashboards, an SRE team or an operations team will have lots of visibility in terms of the health of the system and how things are going, but developers don't have access to any of those dashboards and they can't really see what's going on at any given point in time. So they can't really take ownership of any of those if they're not got that visibility. And again, these are all just kind of tools that you can use to give to provide developers visibility on the entire SDLC. Effectively, the message here is don't lock them out. Figure out a way within your organization to make that work.
Yeah, this also helps answer one of the questions from Adil. So developer experience would make the developer the consumer. In that context, who would be the producer? So the developers are the ones who are consuming these features, but it would be people like the platform team, or you will have a platform tools team who would actually be building these things and configuring the cloud platform to do all of this. And then those teams would be using infrastructure as code features, building their own tooling to produce these things for the dev teams. As a part of doing that,
leverage NARBAC, right? That's a really good example of how to give access safely in production, for instance. Nowadays within the CSPs, RBAC is very well defined. It's not something that you have to go and reinvent the wheel yourself. There's really good practices out there that you can use, whether it's Kubernetes access, whether it's VM access, whichever layer you're targeting in terms of giving the access to logs, for example. There's lots of things that can happen from an RBAC perspective in terms of AD groups, or in terms of grouping, or in this case we're talking about Azure management group, for example, where we have the non-prod management groups within dev and test, and pre-prod and prod, and then the different roles effectively that that's built into the CSPs, right? So again, the myth buster that we have that we can't give dev access to prod instances. Well, you can, and there's a safe way of doing that. It's about identifying and getting the mindset change that actually enabling that access is actually going to be a lot more beneficial. It's because again, from a if there's an incident, for example, and the developer does need to know what's gone wrong, having that sight is much better than being completely blindsided on production. Because the cost of delay could mean that service is down for hours. That could cost some real financial penalties, or a massive cost to the business in terms of uptime.
And this is a example from a Azure platform that we help build, and this is using a built-in using the built-in roles, nothing fancy. And these are kind of cloud provider does a lot of the work for us, and we are just leveraging what's already been built. And I'll just go to the next slide.
And that really comes to the point around, if we're using the RBAC bits, right, unlocking the portals, for example, is another great way of, so that it's native interaction that developers are having, and there's no layer on top needed, right? Your devs already, as I mentioned, will be looking at AWS, GCP, or Azure portals, so give them access in a safe manner. And this is kind of where, the point around getting that safe control and access also means, again, goes back to how, from a developer perspective, they're able to really leverage what they've already learned outside. If they're coming in from other organizations, or even for their own careers, right? If they go, no one stays in an organization forever these days. They're going to move on to other places, but actually, whilst they're engaged effectively within your company, they're going to be utilizing all the tools that are available for them in a way that allows them to be more productive. And choosing those tools to leverage existing knowledge can be a massive news. Don't go for tools that are kind of very bespoke, no one's heard of, because you'll struggle to hire, you'll struggle to keep and innovate within that space. And in fact, Yeah, go on, Hibri, sorry.
Yeah, it's like when developers are learning, they're already learning from the open source ecosystem. They're already tapping into that existing knowledge base. But then if they come into an organization that has lots of custom tools, then there's a huge learning curve. That's not to say that there's no place for custom tools. Like if it works in that organization, yeah, that's all fine. But again, that needs to be built into the experience of, okay, are these tools fit for purpose? Are we duplicating the work that Microsoft, GCP, and AWS have done with their tooling, which is freely available and built into the platform? What are we adding to it? And it's also a matter of scale. At certain scale, you might need lots of custom tooling. You start using things like Spotify Backstage, or if you have mature platform tools team, then you'll be building your own internal platform tooling. This also kind of helps answer one of the questions, like, yes, platform engineering should embrace a product development approach. I talked about having those strong contracts with the platform team, and the platform team should look at how they're enabling other teams to succeed, and that's a continuous thing. The platform team is not doing things for teams; it's helping them be their best and be effective.
Yeah, well, and yeah, thanks Adil for your question, right? So, would you say platform engineering should embrace product development approach? Absolutely, right? To bring this life as an example, one of our recent engagements that me and Hibri were both involved with, we actually had a platform team that were struggling, platform engineering team that was struggling in terms of DevOps tool adoption across the product teams. And so what we did is we actually set up a developer experience unit independently that worked very closely with the development teams to identify all the areas where the bottlenecks were happening in terms of capabilities. And we found out just within a week, we were just talking to kind of 10 to 20 developers, we found out just even basic things like getting access to logs, getting access to even do diagnostics in terms of what's gone wrong with their containers, for example. And these, we're not even talking about production here, we're talking about dev and test environments, right? So again, it depends as an organization how mature you are in some of these practices, but there's a lot that can be uncovered as soon as you start putting yourselves in the shoes of developers and how ultimately enabling them, because for a platform engineering team, your consumers are effectively the product teams, developers who are going to be consuming your platform. It's an internal, your customers are your developers effectively.
Yeah. So let's look at how the interplay between a good developer experience and enterprise cloud adoption. A good developer experience, especially in early days of in the early days of enterprise cloud adoption, reduce the friction in using cloud. And what we find is that when enterprises adopt the cloud, there's a lot of friction using it. Things are locked out. Devs aren't able to use existing tools. It doesn't encourage exploration of cloud features. Devs can't bring what they learn from the outside. For example, I do a lot of my learning when I have some spare time, and I use a different set of tools, like the default Azure or the AWS tool. So if I can't bring that into the enterprise, that's knowledge lost. And there's always a safe, fast path to deliver business value for consumers. And even from the beginning of cloud adoption, yes, that fast path might not be perfect at the start. It's something that will evolve and we need to iterate on, but always keep that safe, fast path to delivery. Helps enterprise cloud adoption.
Yeah, and I think this kind of goes into, in terms of what makes a good experience, in terms of enabling that, is really, adding in guardrails, right, not roadblocks, changing that mindset. And yeah, Adil, I've just seen your comment, right, and again, fantastic, mate. You know, sounds like the first effort that needs to happen is change in enterprise culture. Despite technology available, people and processes remain a bottleneck. And I go back to, you know, let's put the people in, you know, ahead of the processes, right? Adding guardrails, for instance, and not just roadblocks can be another massive shift change. But that needs buy-in at an enterprise level, to understanding in terms of, if you don't do this, what's the impact of it? Not having the right guardrails means that, you know, the developers don't really know what the parameters are in which they should be operating. Putting a roadblock is not going to get you anywhere. It's just going to come to a dead end. You're not going to actually go ahead. You're not going to move ahead from the problem. And and again, going back to the point earlier, developers will then just find ways around that roadblock and try and find how to improve things. CI/CD we talk about all the time. You know, it's the world of DevOps is CI/CD at the moment. But going back to Hibri's point on faster feedback loops, the whole point of having continuous integration, continuous delivery, is to enable that feedback loop, and automation throughout that is a key. The idea of having safe innovation space, trial and failing fast, and it's okay if builds break. You know what? That's perfectly okay. What's more important is that developers are reacting to failing builds and red bits on dashboard. IT is always going to have ups and downs. The systems are going to go down. Things are going to break. That's unavoidable. Moving past that, but actually creating a platform where people can actually react to that a lot quicker, and if they can be even sort of proactive and sort of not, you know, stop it from happening in the first place, that's even better. A lot of emphasis on QE strategy, right? We saw within the State of DevOps report that came out in 2019 now, that, you know, one of the biggest enablers for CI/CD adoption is effectively QE strategy, right? Automation in testing is starting to become a huge bottleneck within enterprises, where, you know, DevOps is starting to be adopted, CI/CD is starting to be adopted, but QE is still a massive pain point and a challenge. And not getting developers early enough visibility into that QE strategy and having those handoffs between developers and testers is still another pain point. The other important bit, community of practice and the culture of learning. I mean, the folks on this call, great you're here, you know, to learn, right? That's the whole point of this. But having that internal community within your own organization or your company is really important, because that will stop, you know, from all that technical debt to be mounting up. To give you an example, one of our customers we worked with, we actually put a community of practice in, and one of the things that we realized as part of an inner source model, that there were 3 different implementations of the same library that 3 different feature teams across the organization had done that, and the implementation was exactly the same. It was the library that was doing the same thing, but 3 different teams are maintaining it in 3 different source codes and repositories. Just bringing those people together as a community of practice meant that we could deprecate 2 of those and just have one that was shared across the entire organization, which meant that, you know, a lot of engagement came out, a lot of technical debt was reduced, and so on and so forth. So you start fostering this culture where things start improving and people are get you know, sort of pulled in rather than DevOps being pushed to them as a result. They actually want to, you know, make lives better for themselves.
Yeah. And that community practice is a key factor in avoiding shadow IT in one government organization we work in. Like we had regular show and tells and forums where tech leads would come and see what was being done on the platform. So it also leads to that design thinking, like we were able to design things that made their lives easier. But also it is a cultural transformation, but we can't also wait for the culture to be transformed before we do these things. And as we do these things, there'll be more roadblocks, and we have to keep solving them. And this is why the DORA metrics are really important, because they show how many of these roadblocks still exist and what impact these roadblocks and bottlenecks are having on the delivery life cycle.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And yeah, just another one, the last point on that slide there, Hibri, in terms of where do you start, right? You know, starting small is a usual. So as an organization, if you're a developer in your company and you think, actually, I don't have a QE strategy and there is an automation or there isn't the guardrails in place, that we don't have communities of practice in place, how do you start? Well, start small, right? Gather like-minded people within the company. One of the, again, going back to say a DevOps report, you know, templating methodology is one of the most successful in transformation across the industry. Forming a little team and just get cracking, you know, almost ask for forgiveness rather than permission is the way to go on that one. Because as soon as you start showing progress in terms of QE strategy, for example, even whether it's adding in some automated integration tests or unit tests or your end-to-end tests might be start to automate those, you'll start seeing the benefits straight away and getting that faster feedback loop again. And showcase that, right? Share that with the other fellow developers, show them the way in terms of, look guys, here's what we've done, and really build momentum and be the kind of the change catalyst, right, in the organization that's needed.
Yeah, and having those faster feedback loops and doing continuous delivery is starting early is actually quite easy, and you know, it's easier when you have 10 lines of code. Your risk is less compared to when you have 10,000 lines of code. Not that lines of code is a indicator of risk, but you get the idea. It's like, you know, the more features you have, the riskier your releases would get. So it's good to start mitigating those risks even early on. So your tests or your checks and balances are proportional to the level of risk that's present in the system that's being built. Yeah, so like having good development experience, like what it ultimately means is creates an environment of psychological safety. And this is a culture thing, like, you know, when you have that psychological safety, devs come to work, they feel like they can be who they want to be and be their best selves, learn, be awesome, and keep learning, and that leads to more ideas, more innovation.
Yeah, and that's so important, right? Because, you know, we go back to why is a good DevEx important? Well, if you don't, I'd say if you don't have one, it's almost kind of a root cause. It allows you to actually identify what the root cause of a lot of the failures are within your entire route to live, and not having that psychological safety again could mean that, you know, you have you staff retention, again going back to that problem, you know, dysfunctional teams, going back to that. You know, and lack of all of these capabilities will result in a lot of poor experiences for the developers, which ultimately means that they don't have that environment where they can really perform and do what they're good at, which is writing really good code and getting that in front of their customers. Yeah.
And it also reduces the cognitive load for a team, because there's only one way to do things, and there's that one way. It's fast and safe. There's not a lot for the dev team to think about. They can focus on the features, they can focus on making the users happy and building awesome user experiences. And then, you know, that leads to better business outcomes.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Great. Yeah. So that's the end of our webinar. We'll pause a bit for any more questions. I hope we've answered.
I think, yeah, Adil just updated on the one saying, you know, guardrails need the security mindset to shift left. So yeah, so one of the things that we're noticing is, again, from a developer experience perspective, if you build coming to an automation, right? So if you've got a CI/CD, great, that's really good. But if there's manual interventions that's needed on the entire route to live, and again, going back to the definition of done, if you're not doing things like your config needs updating, documentation is still pending, security testing needs to be happening, or you know, you haven't really done your code scanning or etc. But as part of your automation, then yeah, certainly those are all things that you're going to want to describe in terms of the guardrails. That, you know, in order for your code to go into production, you need to be having A, B, C, and D quality checks being met. Now, how a development team then enforces that, that's up to them, right? If there's a centralized way of doing that, they can adopt that. If they're a really mature team, they can go off and use whatever tool they want and do it themselves, as long as they're adhering to those guardrails in terms of how to get my code into production. Here's the sort of the list of things I need to tick in order to do that. And your point around is having that as a strategic thing, having senior level buy-in. That's really important as well, because if you don't have that shift left approach in terms of the strategy or just in terms of adoption, you're going to be back in with really long feedback loops, right? Going back to the Tim Cochran diagram again, you're going to be stuck with really long times where you're just getting governance or just validating whether things are working in production, and that's going to again slow you down effectively. Right, do we have any more questions from anybody? I guess I've got a question for you, Hibri, seeing that we've got a couple of minutes. Where have you seen sort of good developer experience implemented? I know I've definitely seen in a few places, but we could, if you could just share with us as part of this Contino live session, just in terms of what's the kind of the good DevEx experiences that you've seen that's enabled cloud adoption?
Yeah, it was actually in an enterprise, and they had a strong team who were pretty much focused on building the tooling. So there was only one way to do things, like here's the HTTP library, web server library that we use. That's it. Here are the API standards that we use. Those decisions were made. And all of that sort of was baked into the CI/CD tooling. So, by using those common frameworks and standardized ways of doing things, devs were able to get into an environment pretty quickly and actually focus on solving the business problems instead of churning lots of cycles, deciding on the technologies that needed to be used and how to use it. Again, that tools team was constantly looking ahead, talking to all the different teams and saying, like, what's coming up next? How do we make the experience better? Feeding that into their backlog and constantly even managing the migration from old versions to new version. And that's a full-time job for that team. And depending on the scale of the organization, you will need a dedicated team to do that.
Yeah, great. Yeah, I've certainly seen it as well, where enabling that good developer experience almost, I mentioned it earlier, right?
Yeah,
changing it from the whole push model to pull model, having other developers brag about how great their CI/CD is and how they can seamlessly get from dev to test to prod is going to make other devs jealous. Honestly, it really will, because other feature teams will be like, I want some of that. Why can't we have that? Why do we have to have 2 to 3 weeks of being stuck and chasing tickets and asking Scrum Master to unblock us and doing all that chasing around and waiting and making more coffee, as you said. So I think, that's kind of a key, really. And hopefully this session has given you kind of some of those insights in terms of why developer experience is really starting to gain a lot of momentum across the industry. You mentioned Backstage, Hibri, as something that's started out off as within Spotify just as a dev team wanting to make life easier for themselves, and it's now sort of starting to get universally adopted across many organizations as well. So just any more closing points from you, Hibri?
No. So thanks for attending this webinar. If you have any more questions, feel free to reach out to us on LinkedIn or Twitter, and happy to continue the conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you all for attending. Goodbye.